Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Good afternoon. I'm Joanne Duncan. I'm the president of Membership and Business Operations Division at Bio, and I'm glad to be here today and happy to have so many here today as well in this session. I'm pleased to introduce this session. We have a great panel for you. The title of this is Seeking Healthcare Sustainability, the Economic Role of Drugs and Therapies. And it's sponsored by Ernst & Young, so I want to thank them in particular for their continued sponsorship of this session. I'm going to introduce the moderator of this session, Glenn Giovanetti, who is from Ernst & Young. Glenn is the global life science sector leader at E&Y. He's been there for over 27 years. He serves clients in both biotech and medical device industries. He has extensive experience in assisting clients with strategic transactions, including equity and debt offerings. He has technology licensing and R&D collaboration experience, joint ventures and acquisitions. So please join me in welcoming Glenn and our panel, and he'll introduce them. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for making it into the post-lunch. I hope you grabbed some lunch, but the post-lunch super session. The introduction was partially right. I'm one of the moderators. I'm just going to kick us off, though, and then I'm going to turn over most of the moderation to Susan Garfield, my colleague, who's sitting in the first chair here. You may see me bounce back up to hopefully represent you all on any questions from the audience. So I know I've done enough of these sessions in various forums that about midway through, everyone's looking at their phone at some point or another. So before we start the session, pull out your phone and type in that little URL down there, bit.ly/ask104n. That'll bring up a little screen. At any time you can submit your question. We'll be monitoring them, and if we've got a good level of curiosity from the audience, I'll pop back up here later, and we will represent some questions from all of you.
Hey, Glenn, should we sign into it too?
If you want to ask a difficult question to anyone else on the panel, I think it's anonymous even, Ron. All right, so before we get going, though, let me do a couple other administrative type of matters. On your chair, near your chair, there's a couple of flyers. So for the last 30 years, believe it or not, Ernst & Young has produced an annual report on the biotechnology industry. We've actually launched it at this event for, well over a decade. We used to do this session solely on that report. We don't anymore. We're going to be a little more topical on issues that are top of mind industry-wide, hence the panel we have here today. But that said, if you were looking for the report, and I'll give you a couple comments on it in a moment, it is available digitally, and the information is on that flyer. If you flip that flyer over, there's also access to a report that is very germane to the discussion today. This is an article that Susan co-authored along with our colleague Ellen Licking, who's down here in front. In vivo a couple months ago, March 2006, a roadmap to strategic drug pricing. And so I'm sure Susan will be exploring, and the panel will be exploring some of the concepts in there. I may even take you through a couple here in our opening comments. One last bit of information. There was a second flyer. At one point, we had a twinkle in our eye that this book that you see there, Marketing Biotechnology, might be ready for this meeting. It is not. It's still in production. It's going to get to a publisher sometime later this summer. We'll hopefully be doing some sessions here next time. But it is a book that I have underway with Dr. Francoise Simon, who's sitting down here as well from Columbia University and Mount Sinai School of Medicine, where we're really taking all the topics, both those that would be in our biotechnology annual report typically, the pricing discussion, but a whole value chain look at marketing biotechnology, including patient centricity, digital, the impact of big data, et cetera. So that's just a little preview. Okay. So a couple words from the biotech report to set up the discussion today. Last year's report, let me tell you, the title of this year's report is Returning to Earth, and that was coming off the heels of last year's report, which was Reaching New Heights. We all remember how fantastic we felt sitting here a year ago about where biotech was. Incredible 3 or 4 year run, but last year in particular sort of topped all all historical numbers in terms of revenue growth, in terms of profits, in terms of capital raised, and on and on and on. And the question and the dialogue at our session here last year and in the hallways was a lot about, when is the bubble going to burst? And we had a lot of commentary about, well, the question is hard landing or soft landing. Obviously, we're going to come off the top. One can't stay at the heights forever. And so hopefully the balloon imagery captures that we think we've had a bit of a soft landing, although maybe some rocky months as we've descended a bit this year. You can see, though, just from a state of the industry perspective, records continue to be hit across the board in revenue, in profits. Market cap even edged up a little bit cumulatively. Lots of great new product introductions, et cetera. That said, the rate of growth slowed dramatically during the year, and part of that slowdown in revenue growth, of course, is just a difficult comparison. We're comparing a 2015 year in the aggregate that had to go against a 2014 that showed the growth ramp of products like Sovaldi and Harvoni from Gilead, and the growth of products from other biotech leaders, Celgene, Biogen, Regeneron, et cetera. So part of it's just a comparison, but part of it is also the headwinds that all of these companies and their larger pharma brethren have felt around the issue of pricing. And that's really where we're going to spend the time today. So those are a couple of data points from the report. This indicates, or this sort of illustrates, I guess, the where the it's one piece of data about where the pressure has been from pricing and why this question is on the top of mind of so many people here at the meeting. There's several sessions taking different angles at pricing. The area under the blue line there is the inflation in branded generic or branded drugs. The black line is the actual cost savings from the introduction of generics. This is data from Express Scripts, but there's many other data sets out there. In fact, our panelists have been involved with producing many of them. But it's illustrative of the pressure as drugs have become, somewhere closer to 20% or more of the overall spend. This is on the top of the agenda. I think that is well understood by everybody. Our hope today is that we'll have a dialogue that is not just about the what, that there's pressure because of the potential unsustainability of growth in healthcare spending broadly, and drugs is an important part of that, but also the how. What do we do about that? How do we move forward to a world where we truly are paying based on value and outcomes? From that in vivo report, just to set up some of the commentary you'll hear in a couple moments here, we put forth this graphic, which really attempted to illustrate from the perspective of companies, but also payers, as new drugs come to market, and certainly there are a lot of very specialized and targeted medicines in the pipeline, despite having great clinical packages that show, in some cases, game-changing efficacy and impact on patients, they really have what we would consider to be potential value at launch, meaning all that data is clinical data under highly controlled environment. And so the real question, one of the key how questions, is how do we move from potential data to potential value to proven value based on actual experience in a clinical setting, collecting real-world data. And so how do we bridge that chasm that is indicated by the red line there as part of the dialogue? Clearly, there are some creative structures that could be put forth, greater risk sharing between payers and innovative companies. But there's a lot, as we know, a lot of barriers and impediments to fully implementing an outcomes and value-based pricing models. Big picture, though, we see this as more of a mindset change. We'll get into the details, but it's really a mindset change for everyone in the industry to move from a world based on pills and volume and sales as key metrics to one of outcomes and value, and as I said, real-world evidence. So 3 key questions here, and I'm sure the panel will take this a lot of different directions, but largely we're going to talk about how do we define value? Who gets to define value? What are the means to define value? what are the creative solutions that can help bridge the gap? We certainly want incentives to be in place for the development of innovative pharmaceuticals. That's important for everybody, payers, companies, physicians, patients above all. However, we're going to need creativity to bridge the value gap. And then as some of these programs and innovative structures begin to roll out, how do we get to scale? Because I think that's a very important question. As we've seen individual deals get done, is there a way to move to something that is much more scalable across not just a particular drug, but a therapeutic area, or maybe even an entire health system? So with that, Susan, let me turn it over to you to introduce our panelists, get some opening comments, and I'll be monitoring your questions if you want to pull your phone out. Once again, well, I don't have it, but I think it was bit.ly/104N. Did I get it? We'll get it back up there. Anyway, Susan.
Thank you so much, Glenn. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session that we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about what many feel is the key issue facing our industry right now. How do we value the innovation that is being developed, and how do we make sure the right therapies are reaching patients in an affordable and accessible way? Someone told me that there's 15 sessions at Bio addressing this topic in one way or the other. I can assure you that this is the best one. The reason I know that are the four people sitting to my left, who I will let introduce themselves. But we have a representation from industry with key points of view from the seat of innovation itself, both smaller and larger companies. Ron comes to us from Accorda Therapeutics, and Dave from Eli Lilly, Michael Sherman from Harvard Pilgrim, and Rena Conti from the University of Chicago. What you'll notice here is we've tried to put together a panel of different points of view. This is the future. So if you're asking yourselves, how are we going to solve the pricing conundrum? How are we going to deal with the issue of escalating prices, costs, access in healthcare? The solution is collaboration across stakeholder groups. It's conversations where we engage in the issues and also explore ways to work together to find solutions. So that's one of the things we're going to do today. So I want to give each of our panel members a moment to introduce themselves, tell you their roles within their organization, and also answer just the brief question, which is, why do you think this topic is of such interest right now, and what can we do to begin to think about solutions to address it? Big questions, small answers, we'll get into the details. So maybe we'll go online, and why don't you get us started?
I'm Ron Cohen. I'm the founder and CEO of Accorda Therapeutics. We're a New York-based company focusing on developing drugs for, or innovative drugs for neurological conditions like multiple sclerosis. We have one drug on the market that took us 15 years to develop, right on schedule, that is indicated to improve walking, a vital function for people with MS. I started out as a physician, so I've learned an awful lot, going from the clinic to running a biotech, a biopharma company. And I also currently serve as the chair of the board of Bio. So welcome to the convention. You asked us to comment on why this is all happening now. Well, why don't we just dive in and be provocative right off the bat? This is not the first time that there has been societal angst about the price of medications. This is something that has sort of gone in cycles for maybe even 50 years. This was a topic back in the 60s as well. It is, however, in my view, and having been in the industry for 30 years, I think this is the most vehement and unrelenting it's ever been. I think there's something different about it now than anything I've seen before. So there's a fundamental shift, and it requires a much more serious and deliberate and collaborative approach than anything anyone's ever paid attention to before. From my perspective, if you want to look at the sort of surface underpinnings of what's going on, I would trace it back to the advent of the ACA, in which, frankly, the insurance industry as a whole probably got the most challenging part of that legislation, because they were directly proscribed from pursuing certain business practices that was part of their business model. So for example, no longer being allowed to deny coverage for people with pre-existing conditions, having a cap on their margins, 15% to cover administrative and fees and profit, and everything else had to be payouts. Faced with that, they had to come up with other ways of thinking about their business models. And one way that, and I think a major way that came out, was that the industry started changing the way it was paying for reimbursing its subscribers for drugs. So that co-pays went up, co-insurance went up, tiering became more intensive, prior authorizations became more ubiquitous, step edits became more ubiquitous, and what happened was there was a squeeze on access. So de facto, there was a denial for pre-existing conditions, but it was because people would go to the drugstore and they'd say, well, let's have a $200 copay or a $100 copay. And for many people, maybe most people, they would say, wow, I can't afford that. So they would leave their drug at the counter, or they would take it and then they'd take half as much to spread it out twice as long, so it wasn't as effective. And over time, that built up a huge amount of entirely justifiable angst about, I can't afford my medications. Now, I don't know if Mike will disagree with this or not, but it is factual that one of the other things that happened was that AHIP, which is the American Health Insurance representative, basically the bio of the health insurance industry, launched a campaign over the last few years. It was a very deliberate campaign to point at the drug industry and say, your prices are way too high, this is why people can't afford their drugs. And then, of course, it just, so the ground was set for the kerosene and then the match that took the form of Valiant and Turing last fall, where all of a sudden these egregiously bad examples of how not to develop and provide access to drugs were now being held up as representative of the entire industry. So, and then it's a political season, it's presidential season, so it's a confluence of factors that are all fanning the flames. And the challenge and the risk I see is that this threatens to engulf all of us, not just the ability of biopharma to continue to innovate and provide these medical advances that we all need, but for the insurance industry to cover people and to do it in the right way. And the only way I see of approaching it is, instead of pointing fingers at each other, we have got to get together and put the creative minds across the board on solutions.
Thank you. Dave, what are your thoughts? And please introduce yourself and maybe think about what does this mean for Lilly and moving forward.
Sure. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, Dave Ricks with Lilly, of 20 years at the company. I currently look after our biomedicines business. This is both a therapeutic group, which includes neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's research, immunology, others. And I have geographic responsibility for Japan, US, and Europe. And I agree with the comment earlier that it is a global discussion. I think a lot of what Ron said is right. The only thing I'd add is I think one of the pressure points here is if we look across healthcare, I'm sure E&Y does this, it's difficult to find places where we're just getting pure efficiency. Yet we have a lid on cost growth because we're running out of money to fund healthcare. This is particularly acute in Europe, which I look after, right, where they just have said post-crisis there is no more money. And at the same time, I think really the bloom is on the rose of biotechnology. Here we are at the Bio Conference. I've been in the industry 20 years, some maybe longer, but I've never seen a period of such promise. We just come from ASCO. I mean, what we can do now to manage what used to be literally death sentence diseases is phenomenal. My company exited Hep C in 1998 because we viewed it as intractable. And look what happened, right? Now we're virtually curing it, and that's a topic of controversy, but there's not new money within the drug budget, certainly, to pay for this. So I think we're entering an area where we have to find a way to move the boundaries, change the rules of the road of how we've planned financially for better health in a world where we have to capitate total growth, taxpayers won't pay more for health.
Thank you. Dr. Sherman.
Yes, hi, Michael Sherman. I'm Senior Vice President for Health Services and Chief Medical Officer for Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. We're a 1.3 million member commercial plan in New England, in Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, primarily commercial, and I kind of feel like we're at the center of this. So let me share a perspective and some data. So first of all, we don't actually pay for drugs, and I can understand why you would think we do because we're payers. But the fact is that we actually are struggling to break even this year. We lost tens of millions of dollars last year, as did many other payers, for a variety of reasons. So that is what it is, but it means that when there is a new drug that comes to market that impacts a trend that's more expensive, it means that the idea that we're paying for it is not accurate. It means that either the individual's paying for it, which, you know, there are cost shares, but our feeling is that above a certain coinsurance, and we cap most of it at $300 per prescription, because we want people to get their medications generally. So, you know, more and more, it's all of us. So it gets put into premiums. I'll also add that 55% of our customers, our members, are actually through self-insured employers. So they actually pay the charge themselves, whether it's for hospitals or for drugs or devices, whatever, and they pay us a small administrative fee each month. So they're saying this, they're angry as hell, and this represents an impact on their profitability and on dollars, quite frankly, that I'm sure you'd agree as an economist, that would have gone into increases in pay and other things. So it is a real issue. I would say that of the premium increases we're filing for next year, about a third to one half of them are because of drug costs. Another data point. Our costs for drugs, I think they're going to go up about 10% this year, year over year, in an environment where most of it's going up closer to 3%, all the provider assistance, et cetera, and where the specialty pharma piece of it, I think, is going to go up more like 20, which sounds bad, except it's pretty good, since if you'd asked me a year and a half ago, I would have said that specialty pharma was going up at about 34%. And it's not that we're actually better, it's that Hep C is in the base now. So those are real issues. Another data point. I know because I was at the session this morning, there were brochures on the chairs saying that 10 to 14% of the healthcare dollar goes to drugs. I don't know where that came from, but all I do know is what we spent last year in 2015, because I was curious, what do we actually spend? I know some of these numbers look at denominators, including long-term care costs, et cetera, but as a commercial insurer, I asked, what did we actually spend? And so out of the billions of dollars that we spent, 26% went for drug costs. And just to be fair, as I think certainly those in this country know, we tend arbitrarily to divide it up into a pharmacy and medical benefit. So the pharmacy benefit was about 21%, and the medical benefit was the other 5%. So that's real, and again, it is something that we have to manage, because our goal is to keep care affordable and to be able to, to sell business that employers, to sell products that employers can purchase. So that's why it's an issue. I'll also add, before we move on, in terms of what we're doing about it, I'm really gratified by the opportunity we've had to pay for value and enter into new kind of discussions around paying for value. But on the other hand, we're also under a lot of pressure. So we recently started a closed formulary, which is more restricted than our open. That's up to 40% of our membership. And what's new, since we actually last spoke, Susan, is now there are those in my organization who think we should kill off the open formulary and introduce an even more closed formulary that's more restrictive. Again, in the interest of selling to employers what they want, which is making those trade-offs. So if we can't figure out how to work together, then I think that's inevitable.
Thank you. Ina.
Now for something different. So I'm a health economist at the University of Chicago, and most of my work is on drug pricing and spending. I'm also a family member of many people who have suffered and died with cancer. So my perspective is of a citizen who's very concerned as well. So let me tell you what I think the big tensions are. We are in an unprecedented wave of new technology. There will be cures, real cures, for dread disease that includes cancer, but many other types of diseases that have not seen very significant therapeutic advance. I think by my last count, there are something like 1,000 agents under development currently. This is incredible news for patients and for their families. At the same time, wage growth is stagnant. Actually, the average median income, median household income in America is 9% lower than it was during the Reagan years. That's a problem, right? Not only that, but I think the vast majority of seniors are living on fixed incomes, only fixed incomes, where the average monthly payout is something like $1,300 a month. I think there are a lot of tensions here that are related to wanting these new cures, wanting access to new therapies, and yet at the same time trying to figure out how they're going to pay for their drugs relative to all of the other expenses that they have or their loved ones have. So the key question is how. One of the things that I find very frustrating is that in the public conversation there's this slippage. We heard it even today in our discussion already between prices and costs and spending. Those are not the same things. Spending is quantity times price. Price is a component of spending. One thing I think that we need to get clear on is whether we need to do something about prices or we need to do something about quantity. And I think right now we're seeing many actors in the system trying to kind of adjudicate between whether we need to do something about prices or whether we need to do something about spending or something about quantity, where quantity is kind of under the control of physicians and or insurers to manage as opposed to patients. Lastly, if we want to do something about spending, there's a lot of money locked into the system right now. There are a lot of players who make money off the pharmaceutical industry as it exists now. So I think there are many folks in academia and also policymakers that would like to throw pharma under the bus. But my view is that if we're going to throw pharma under the bus, we also have to look very hard and long at hospitals, at pharmacies, at pharmacy benefit managers, and all of the other institutions that are also making money off of keeping drug prices high, and try to unlock that money to be shared with patients and to come back into the system in some way. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So a lot of themes already. I hope you're jotting down notes. I know I was. I want to start with something that Dr. Sherman alluded to. And when we think about this issue of cost to the system, each of you kind of mentioned it in different ways, this tremendous anxiety out there, some of which is centering around a perception that things are just priced too high. Some of it is related to kind of this look at year-on-year growth and is it sustainable? And others are looking at it from the standpoint of the patient. Can they bear this cost burden? But it strikes me that what we're really talking about is the predictability of costs to the system. And if we could manage that predictability, we might have a better opportunity to direct healthcare resources to those things where we believe they will have the most impact. You should all also know, this is a fun game you can play with yourself. I'm currently playing it with myself. I'm going to try to run this whole session without saying the word value. So I think we've seen in this debate that we keep mentioning this word. No, we can debate all day what it means. There's different meanings of it. Different people are trying to create frameworks to assess what it means. But I think we need to move beyond that debate and get a little bit more specific. So that's something to keep in your mind as this goes on. So let's talk about predictability. Do you think there's anything we can do when thinking about pricing, thinking about costs, where increasing the amount of predictability for payers and patients might improve the debate?
Well, I think that means we have to talk about value.
You can talk about it, I'm just not.
This is one of those subjects that the more at least I find, the more I delve into it, the almost harder it is to understand. Because the further you go, the more Byzantine complexity you come up with. And which is why I say there is no single party that can solve this. This has to be a process that involves all of the stakeholders in the healthcare system. That includes government, not only the payers and the biopharmaceutical innovators, but even patient advocacy groups and government bodies, regulators. Each one has a piece of the puzzle. The predictability is fine, but I think predictability implies that you have already established some frameworks for how do you, and notice I didn't say a framework, but some frameworks for how you determine value. And you know, Michael and I were talking earlier, I forget who it was who observed this, but it's quite true. You know, cost is what you pay, value is what you get. And those two are conflated and confused a great deal, but we have an issue with being able to pay for what we're getting, but we also have an issue in distinguishing what it is we're getting in every case of different drugs and what it is we want to pay for, should pay for a given value proposition. Most of the frameworks that have been proposed are flawed in different ways. And I would submit that there is not a one-size-fits-all here. However, what encourages me, to the extent that I have any encouragement, is that there are experiments that are already blossoming, right, in experimental programs for particular drugs between that innovator and various large insurers to see if we can begin to sketch out what does value look like and how should it be paid for, and when the value is not there, how do you determine that, and then how does that money come back because you don't deserve it, you didn't provide the value. I'll give you just one example and then I'll let someone else talk. For the one drug we have, Ampera, when we put it out there, it was for improving walking in MS. No one knew what that meant. Right? We had clinical trial data that was very clear, but no one really knew what it meant, and we went through a process of years, several years of negotiation, discussion, trading sort of thoughts and education with the various payers and PBMs about it. But the thing we did that finally turned it for us, there was one thing we did, and someone in the company came up with it, and as soon as I saw it, I jumped on it and said, wow, that's brilliant, let's do that. We came up with a program called First Step. And again, this is for our drug. We came up with it unilaterally because everyone has to figure out their own drug and what to do with it. But in our case, we said, you know what, the clinical trial data clearly showed that only about 40% of the people with MS who take the drug actually respond to it. That means about 60% don't, at least for walking. So we said, you know what, it takes up to 6 to 8 weeks at the outside to figure out between the doctor and the patient whether it's working. So we'll just give it free for 2 months. We won't ask for any reimbursement. We'll just give it free for 2 months and let the doctor and patient work out if it's helping them. And by that time, the people that are not being helped, most of them are going to drop off. And then the ones that stay are the responders, and we should get paid for that, and then we'll go to commercial pay. So we did that. You know what? It turned out to be, in essence, a value and outcome-based solution. Because then we went to managed care and we said, this is what we're doing. And we were very gratified to say that they gave us credit for it. They said, wow, that's great. You know, you're putting your money where your mouth is. We're not paying for it. We'll work with you. And most of them said that. Some of them didn't. But that's the kind of thing. And that's something that we did, right? If you just sort of spread that out along, you know, 1,000 different or hundreds of different companies and thousands of different products, each one you can talk about, for that specific indication, how do we come up with a value proposition?
Mm-hmm. A lot of innovation there, and certainly a great example of that. So what about you, Dave? You have a recent collaboration with Anthem.
Yeah.
You know, was predictability in terms of costs or outcomes important? Were there other paradigms more important to drive that deal?
Yeah, I think it's key, and in some ways maybe the easiest way to find common ground, because a lot of this has to do with planning. If you buy into my earlier comment that we have a big planning problem, you have massive innovation that is disrupting, in some cases, how care is delivered in certain disease states, but it's very difficult to rearrange the assets, if they're hard assets like hospitals or doctors under contract, et cetera, to fund that if we believe this system is basically fixed in cost. So planning is an important part of solving the problem. I think already there's a lot of planning that happens with price predictability. It's a pretty common feature across nearly every commercial contract we have, so that there is a cap on inflation. Some people, maybe the economists, might argue that drives up more inflation in the list pricing because those that don't have it bear the brunt of it, but that's a tool that's been in place for many, many years. We're advocating for a new tool with Anthem, and I'm interested in what the other panelists have to say about this, which is to really to get a safe harbor or carve out from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which today prohibits commercial discussions pre-FDA approval. We think this is a relatively common sense and simple thing to do, and would allow us to sit down with Harvard Pilgrim years in advance of a drug launch, share our volume forecasts for what we're hoping the drug, who it could help, and what kind of value points, what kind of price might be associated with that. They may like that or not like that, but at least we can start sharing the information. So as they price their products, and remember now, a lot of insurance companies really aren't insurance companies anymore, they're subcontractors for the federal government, which has very fixed bid rules, often 18 to 24 months in advance. So if a drug comes out after they bid, they have a huge economic problem. A lot of the Sovaldi situation was that. So we think that's a tool that can help this. The other way we're planning is just what Ron was saying, is moving away from frameworks to actual demonstrated value as a fundamental principle. Frameworks are useful, but they're forecasts, and we've all sat around boardrooms, and we all can debate any forecast, right? Nobody likes a forecast. It's all about assumptions, moving away from assumptions and extrapolations from clinical trials to actual real performance in a plan, in a population.
Mm-hmm. And so would the demonstrated impact be a deal that you set out with a plan ahead of time to
That's right. And so we've got several of these going now, although they're difficult to pull off. You can do them in the commercial space most easily, but you have to have the will to create them, which I think most industry is building along with our payer customers. But you also need data, and sometimes that's difficult. The endpoints you had in your clinical program aren't readily accessible in the real world. So you need to find common ground of what can we measure that's a good proxy, or in the case of some things you actually do get measurement, like a hard endpoint of readmission to hospital. Okay, we can measure that. And then you can share risk around that principle. And then the other thing you need is trust, because I think we have to trust that our drug will deliver value. I'm going to use that word. We have to stand behind the value. And I think the payer has to agree to say, well, if I actually save that money, I can redistribute dollars to fund this medicine. And the rate or the price point floats based on the performance of the drug. We've also called for, with Anthem, a number of policy carve-outs that could allow this to happen in other segments where the rules are much more regulated. So AMP pricing rules, government price reporting, Medicaid best price, all interfere in a massive way with the private market's ability to get together on these things. And we need a carve-out, at a minimum, maybe a wholesale revisit of all those things to allow the market to work and individual innovators to contract with payers and find a way to contract for value.
So if you don't mind, if I could just jump in and then on that, because it's just directly in line with what we talk about at Bio on all this. So I think David just hit certainly a big nail on the head. In order to allow these experiments to take root and allow these conversations to take place between certainly the pharmaceutical innovators and insurers, government has a big role to play right now, which is, to David's point, to relax or carve out a lot of the regulations that are inhibiting us, that because it's against the law, from doing it, or that
Or
make it
economic
economically
suicide.
infeasible because of best price rules. So there's some very clever amortization or mortgage type schemes for paying for chronic drugs over a long period of time, or paying for an acute drug rather over the, a period of time when you'll accrue the benefits over the next 10 years. But you can't do it because under best price rules, they're going to say, oh, well, your drug is actually at 10% of what you said, so now you take your best price off that for government pay, which is not economically feasible. So government can do a lot right now. Rather than trying to regulate more, I would submit, to David's point, they actually need, almost counterintuitively, to regulate less to allow these experiments to take place.
Yeah, I think the predictability is only a part of it. It can be predictable and still overvalued by any sane amount, but again, it is desirable. So let's look at the PCSK9s versus Hep C. PCSK9s are expensive. Yet after our Hep C experience, we spent a lot of time with the two companies coming out with them, doing models, and we built it into our projections and into our premium. So again, I still don't know if we'd agree that they're good value, but it created less angst for us. The other point I'll make is, and I think people know, we have an outcomes-based contract with Amgen for Repatha, where there is an element of the payment which is tied to reduction in cholesterol. But what is perhaps lesser known and hasn't been hyped as much, but I give them credit for, although given the less than stellar uptake is not really an issue, is that there was actually price protection built into the contract on a PM-PM basis. So we were so worried about the explosion in PCSK9 use that if it exceeds a certain PM-PM at different tranches, the price changes, which I applaud them for. The other thing to keep in mind, predictability, it's not just us, it's the providers. So if there's one message that you walk out of here understanding, it would be that 85% of our providers are in some sort of outcomes-based payment agreement for at least a portion of their population. I chair our P&T committee, and they are ticked off. They're angrier about the pricing than I am, because the old model, we're going to go market these drugs, kind of a pull strategy, coming out of the payers' pockets, that's not true anymore. Only 10% of our patients are fully capitated, but even the majority of the rest are in these total cost of care agreements, where the cost of the drugs is a piece of the care that can add or subtract to additional payments based on how their population is trending versus a broader population. So to the extent that high-cost drugs come out, which are seen by the docs as not being high value, they're voting with their feet and with their prescription pads. A couple of other points I'll make. Again, if we're going, and I applaud Ron for how they're thinking about their product. I said before that 26% is our current number on drugs. I didn't say that was bad. I don't have a target of minimizing drug spend. I have a target of maximizing value. And if we see more drugs that push that up to 30%, and we're seeing the right health economic outcome models, back to understanding the full cost structure, and we're reducing the burden of disease or amputations or hospitalization or ED use, maybe that's a good number. If we see more $6,000 drugs like Jubilee for toenail fungus, that's probably not something we'd want to see. Right. But I'm very, at the end of the day, I think we need to work together to show that we're not creating a win-lose, but a win-win in creating value. So I'm thrilled with our contract with Amgen. Entresto, we haven't signed it, but I'm probably a few days from signing the agreement with Novartis. And again, an example, ICER looked at the value, said it's fair value. The ACC just came up with new guidelines, I think just the past couple of days, AHA, ACC, that suggests we should want more people to be on this. And Novartis is willing to put their money where their data is, saying if there are not reductions in hospitalization, in which we can track, that it will affect the price of the drug, and I think that's terrific. And I'll give you one more example, which is hot off the press, literally hot off the presses. So as I mentioned, I chair our P&T committee. We met last night. I did that telephonically because I was here in San Francisco. And we discussed the Lilly drug Trulicity, which is a GLP-1 agonist. And they had wanted, right now it's on the non-preferred tier. They want it on the preferred tier. And again, this speaks to an article that Susan and others at E&Y wrote, but about, it's helpful to pharma to have more than one dimension, right? If it's just price, wouldn't you rather be talking about other dimensions as well? Yes. So Lilly actually offered us an outcomes-based component, and I give them a lot of credit for it. And they were, again, the docs as well as our internal people last night were very excited. We did vote to put Trulicity on the preferred tier, And again, there was a lot of positivity around the data packet and many other attributes. And I'll just say, and again, we haven't signed it, I'm going to sign it, but the element of it is that there is certain rebate with respect to placement. And then we look at how, and this I can't give you guys enough credit for, not just against just arbitrary outcome targets, but against other GLP-1 agonists. Yeah. And if their drug does a better job of lowering hemoglobin A1C versus the competition, if it does a better job, they get more money. The price of the drug goes up. And if it's inferior to the other GLP-1 agonists, they get less money, the costs go down. I mean, talk about putting your money where your data is and not hiding behind things like real-world evidence. I mean, that's impressive, and I have to give them a lot of credit for that.
Those are great examples. I think we do need to have a real policy effort as an industry to change these rules which prohibit more of it. And because I think there are, unfortunately, fewer examples than we'd like of being able to get together on agreements like that.
So I'm going to be a little provocative and answer the question in a different way, which is the following. Innovation breeds unpredictability. And so in an era where there's a lot of innovation, of course there's going to be unpredictability that the payers and other people who are paying ultimately the bills are going to have to face. I think that there's a confluence of unpredictability here that's part of the problem. There's the innovation piece related to drugs, but there's also significant shifts in care that are going into the hospital, and that can double or even triple the bill that payers are facing, but also, frankly, that patients are facing. And so payers are in this kind of uncomfortable position of having to kind of deal with both of these components. At least I think that the merger and acquisition, the site of care shifting portion is mostly related to ACA changes. The other thing that's really important to note is that the prices of drugs have changed substantially. I tremble at saying this in this room, but I'm going to state the obvious, that when I first started working on drug policy, the thing that the states were really worried about were those antipsychotic drugs and the new antidepressants that cost $40, maybe $400 per month per prescription per patient. Now we're talking about $200,000 per episode of care. And so there's a sticker price. That is a sticker price. It's not the real price that people pay. But the optics around the order of magnitude change, I think, are difficult for payers to adjust, but also difficult for patients, and then difficult for policymakers, most notably the states, who frankly are dealing with very fixed budgets to deal with. I think the last thing I'll say is that the prices are list prices. We know those are sticker prices, but payers have a lot of anxiety related to discounts and rebates that come off the top of those list prices.
If they're meds for that anxiety, good.
Right, exactly. Exactly. There are anti-anxiety drugs to help them. But that's
generic.
Right,
They're very cheap. Yeah.
But no, I mean, I think that, again, the optics around the list prices, they feed into public debate. They also feed into anxiety about doing something. But then all of these existing discounts and rebates may or may not get shared with patients, may or may not get shared with certain types of payers, certainly go into getting these prices to be as high as they are. And so that is a dynamic that needs probably to be revisited as well.
So you mentioned a couple things, and they echo the comments of other panelists. So clearly there's a trust gap in the industry. There's a trust gap between the general populace and the industry, and there may be a trust gap between industry and payers. But it feels that we are starting to address that, certainly between industry and payers. The examples that Dr. Sherman and Dave, you're talking about, Ron, that you're talking about, I would imagine are trust builders. They're enabling us to work together in new and better ways. The data that is now currently available to the stakeholders should be trust builders, enabling some of these agreements and innovative approaches to move forward. So I guess the question is, how do we move forward? I agree, Rena, with your points.
Yep.
But let's take that as the baseline.
Right.
There's an issue. How do we try to bridge that trust gap to move to more of these innovative approaches that will probably become more standardized, and use some of the tools that are now available to us that weren't in the past?
So I'd like to start, which
Yeah,
is
please.
the following. You can charge $200,000 for your product if it works. And it provides real value. Patients will pay it, their employers will pay it, the payers will likely pay it. I'm speaking for you. But you also have to probably demonstrate cost savings in other ways, most notably inpatient stays and other things that are really costly to the system.
Yeah, let me add to that. So, I think right now a couple of things. First, transparency. There's, I think, a perception that when a pharma company set prices, the game is how high can we go before we're publicly shamed? And I think that's probably not true of the majority, based on the people I know and interact with, whom I have a lot of respect for. But just showing it's based on all the drugs that came in and the number that have failed. It's based on a reasonable return to shareholders. It's based on cost offsets. It's based on something that people can see and understand. That's one problem. Second is just the fact that a lot of the high-cost drugs have variable responses. So, my frustration is that, and I think, again, I applaud your example, if it works and it's a small population, we understand it may need to be priced at a couple $100,000. That's not the problem. Where we get angry or where we have drugs that are a couple $100,000 with a variable response. And one of my personal frustrations is, while I'm really thrilled about the deals we've done, I've spoken to some of the pharma companies for some of these rare diseases. And I've suggested to them, okay, let's say that your drug, which I know is for a limited population, is worth so many hundreds of thousands. Let's not even debate that. But we also know that there is a number of them that aren't responding, or maybe they're not worsening. And yes, that's not the data you put out there, but you're arguing that that is a benefit. Do you think maybe it's worth a little bit less for those? And perhaps because of the fact that strategically they've gone into indications with limited competition, in all of those cases, they've said no, thank you. So it's hard. The other thing I want to add, though, is, and again, getting back directly to your question, I think these kind of panels and discussions are critical, and nothing supports success like success, right? So I applaud the work that you guys are doing and all of the people I so respect on the pharma side, and that's why I'm happy to share the example that I did about Trulicity. So the docs are being paid for value. They see this, and the ones on the P&T committee, they were blown away. We shared some of the details, because a lot of it is confidential. But do you think that they're going to want to prescribe the drug of the company that is standing behind their product, or the one that's saying, hey, it's a cost, and if nothing happens, it's someone else's problem? So I think by showing that this can drive what they're interested in is product utilization, formulary placement, and adoption by the physicians and others in the ecosystem. I mean, nothing like that to drive more of this type of dialogue.
Yeah. Dave, are these innovative agreements, are they more than just ways to get access? Do they become commercial differentiators?
Well, I think that's how we think. And I think in the case of this example, and thanks for mentioning that, I mean, here you're not only standing behind the value against other types of care, but the direct replacements. And so if it delivers, good for everybody involved. We've talked today about the predictability and planning. I think that's essential but not sufficient. I agree with Michael on that. And we can do a lot more there as an industry. These forums help, but we need to sit down across from conference room tables and just help each other run our businesses. I think these outcomes-based agreements are critical because they unlock the possibility to get on the same side. And our experience, we haven't announced them all, but I can tell you our company has signed several of these. We haven't had one go the wrong way, meaning that our clinical trial data actually was a lower level performance than the real world. That's pretty encouraging to us. And it kind of makes sense because patients who get into trials are highly refractory, difficult to treat, whereas all comers have done better. And I think that's given us a lot of courage. The final topic, which was raised here, and I think is an important maybe discussion for another panel, is the inequities in the insurance markets. One, against pharmaceutical innovation, which although we make up an important part of the spending and that needs to be managed, patients pay out of pocket a lot more for medicines and other forms of care, and I think that's true in virtually every segment. And I wonder why. Why is there a tax on that particular segment that the patient has to pay? And I think also the question of the intermediaries and what the value add is. I think they started as sort of information aggregators, but I think that needs to be looked at as well. I think what everyone wants is more innovation and access to care.
Yeah.
And I guess we're all about trying to solve that problem.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, I would point out that Bio in February put out a list of principles related to pricing, value, reimbursement. I believe to this point we are the only significant representative organization in the whole healthcare system, whether it's insurers or pharmaceuticals or hospitals, whatever, who's put out a statement like this. And what we did was we brought our members together around the board and we committed to the very core concept. One, that we as an organization in our industry are going to commit ourselves to access. That it's not enough simply to innovate and then put the drugs out there and then someone will pay for them. We're committing that part of our responsibility is that not only to make the drug, but to make sure that anyone who needs it and could benefit from it is getting it, and that those who don't benefit from it get off it, right? And that we don't get paid for it. And number two, that we commit ourselves to putting as much creativity into thinking about how we show value and how we get paid for value, and collaborating with other members of the healthcare system in ways that allow us to move the ball forward together, create what Michael called a win-win. So we have that now, and it's a start, right? It's a statement. We need to fill it in. You asked earlier, how do you build trust? The reality is this is an incredibly diverse ecosystem. There are players with a lot of integrity. There are players possibly with different principles. And that exists across every industry, right? It exists in ours. It exists in the insurance industry. It exists all around. That's human nature, right? That's the diversity of humanity. To my mind, it is incumbent on those of us who have like-minded principles, no matter what seat we're sitting in, which is we're proud to be part of a system that produces the most innovative ecosystem for medicine that human history has ever seen, and it's in the United States for a reason. 60%, it's been estimated, of the innovation is taking place here. We have 3% of the world's population. It's because we have free markets, it's because people are willing to invest and people are willing to pay. So to me, for those of us who are proud of that and want to perpetuate it on all sides, we need one good demonstration product after another, like the ones that Michael and David were talking about, one after another, where we're able to build a catalog and show people this works. This is the way to do it. Not that way, but this way. And you do enough of those, and I believe eventually it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, I think, again, the example you gave is a right way of thinking of it. I had a discussion with a major pharma company around an oncology drug. I said, how about if you give us 2 months and if it works, we'll pay for it. Again, think, we're talking about how to pay for all this. Think about all the money spent on drugs that don't work. Again, and as we go toward more of a genomic basis, I think that'll improve, but it's a real issue. And if we actually stop paying for the things that don't work, and which we don't want to pay for, and it's hard for anyone to make a case that we should be, that opens up a lot of money that we can use to pay for these new therapeutics. I think that alone would solve the problem.
Right.
Fantastic. I think, Glenn, we have some questions from the audience.
Yeah, well, one, I was trying to jump on at the opportune time, and when Rena made the point about payers will pay for $200,000 therapies that work, there's a couple here about payment for innovation and cost offsets, and Michael, maybe to direct one at you from the audience around, how do you think about amortizing benefit? Some discussion occurred about maybe annuity-based payment models and so forth, but aside from that, today, do you have a formula to think about, take a Sovaldi example where you might be, avoiding liver transplants 5-10 years down the road. sure, there's value, but what's the reasonable period for a cost offset for a drug of that cost, or even higher to 200,000?
You know, there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. So again, for things that are down the road, like 5-10 years, that's really outside of, I think, a typical commercial payer's event horizon, so to speak. But you know something, our mission is to serve our members. So to this, in the sense that there's clear value, and what generally would happen is that everyone pays for it. You don't get a situation where one payer pays and the other doesn't because it's a no-brainer. So, you know, you don't have that tragedy of the commons problem. In other words, maybe we won't have that member in 5 years, but someone else will have someone else's and they paid for it. So I'm less worried about that. I think the issue for me is where there's not a clear value proposition, particularly for some newer drugs. And I will say for us, I think we have a very good relationship with our customers and a reputation. So most of our members actually are with us 3-5 years or even longer. In many cases, I'm less worried about that. And again, I mentioned that over half, and it's been growing, of the members are self-insured, and they tend to have a longer look-back period as well. So it's a lot easier if we can show within 3 years or so that there's something. But I think we also need to think about new models and innovation. To me, that's part of the fun. So we've actually had dialogues with companies that have said, we have a new drug, and if you use it, it's more expensive, and then there won't be exacerbations over years 2, 3, 4, 5. And so, you know, rather than talk about why you can't do it, let's talk about how we can. And we've proposed opportunities such as we'll keep on providing additional annuity payments for that member, you know, so long as, again, that outcome persists. And if they should leave our plan, there'll be some intermediate level kind of terminal value payment to make up for it. The other issue that we're going to have to deal with are for some of these very expensive gene therapies, where I think we are going to need new vaccine fund kind of models, because you get a few of those and it could put some payers into some dire financial straits. So they need to be paid for. We just need a different model for that.
So I would agree with you and say that we do have annuity. It's called Social Security and Medicare. All of us pay taxes into that fund. The question is, we may not get the benefits when we need them, right? One question is whether certain types of therapies may get carved out into other types of payment models entirely. So the Vaccine for Children's Fund, the HIV, AIDS drugs, they have different pricing policies and different distribution systems because we view them as being public health goods and we need to pay for them in a very different way. It's entirely possible that there will be innovations that will come through the pike that will look similar to that in the future.
Yeah, another government model to look at is the ESRD program, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And, you know, we want to go to the audience. We have about 5 minutes left. So if there's anyone who has a question that didn't use...
And we can go a little long on that. I don't know if you can see that clock down there.
I can't.
You got closer to 15.
We've got 15 minutes, folks. But I think it ends at 2. Okay, either way.
We started a little late, but go ahead.
One question I want to ask you, it's a comment that several of you have made in different ways, and it deals with transparency. And there's several laws at the state level right now being introduced around drug price transparency. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. And if there is greater transparency in how we get to the end net price, not list price, do you think this will fuel or diminish innovation? I know a lot of the stakeholders we talk to say that won't let us do some of the really wonderful things we're trying to do. So thoughts on transparency?
Maybe I'll jump in quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, the bills I've seen are not actually focused on drug pricing, but actually on R&D input costs, which is a totally irrelevant conversation, actually, because it doesn't account for failure. Right? So we're doing Alzheimer's research. In the last 15 years, 0.4% of the projects that went into the clinic made it through the FDA. So by just looking at the cost of the 0.4 that made it, you learn nothing about the cost to develop an Alzheimer's drug. I think transparency in the market gets hard when you're entering a world of one-by-one outcomes-based contracts. What is actually the price point if it floats based on some health metric? So I think this line of thinking is a difficult one. Rather, we're advocating for freeing up the market to get together one by one and find solutions.
Yeah.
So David has been very kind in his characterization. I will not be so kind. It is a complete red herring, in my view, this whole drug transparency. You have all these different states. Vermont just passed a different type of law, not really a transparency law, but related. California's working on a ballot initiative that's going to come in November. This whole move toward price transparency is akin to the drunk who drops his keys outside and then looks for it under the lamppost because that's where the light is, not because that's where he dropped it. And really, that's what you're looking at here. It is a complete non sequitur, and it's counterproductive, if anything, because to David's point, the inputs have nothing to do, almost nothing to do, with what it takes to promote innovation and provide a return on investment, because you're investing in the whole ecosystem, right? To your point, 99.6% of all clinical trials on Alzheimer's to date have failed. They had to be invested in order to get the one drug that came out or the ones that are going to come. And there's no way around that, because you might say, well, that's stupid. Why don't you just invest in the winners, right? Because if you knew what the winners were, it'd be a lot easier.
I wouldn't be sitting here.
Right? Right. And that's the issue. What I think we need to get a collective understanding, not just in this room, but in general out there, by all the stakeholders, is an understanding that if you want that drug that's going to prevent Alzheimer's, so that you and I don't wind up drooling in our chairs in a nursing home one day, if you want that, you have to understand that we have to invest in this entire ecosystem, and therefore the winners that really provide value have to get a high return. And by the way, they don't get it forever. They get it for a limited exclusivity period, 10 to 15 years. If it's really valuable, it's an incredible bargain, because you pay for it for, let's say, 15 years, even if it's 20 years. Copyrights go to 100, right? So even if it's 20 years. But then it goes generic, and forever you're getting it for pennies on the dollar. Our systems for payment do not currently account for that. And if they did, we might have a better way of approaching these issues.
Yeah, and another comment on on transparency. So and again, a very fair comment that the way a number of the bills are being structured, they're looking at a drug, not at a portfolio. And as we all know, the failure rate is high, so I could not agree more. But I think what's missing here is a whole point about why this is happening. Mm-hmm. It's not that our elected officials, want to be experts on drug pricing. There's a distrust and a sense of somehow we're getting screwed. So and if we can somehow figure out how to kind of relieve that pain through some of the collaborative things we've been talking about, I think that will go away. This is about that they think the people in their state are overpaying, and we need to get away from that. So the other thing I'll make about transparency is, for me personally, what I care most about is understanding the health economic outcome model, the cost offsets. To me, that's most important. And if you can show me a strong model that makes it irrational for us, not to pay for something, then good for you. And then that's part of why. And we don't have a lot of models. There are some out there that are excellent, and we tend to respond to them. But that's why there's so much interest in things like ICER now, which is coming up with different kind of models around drug pricing. I think all of us, whether it's the payers or our elected officials, are looking for some objective signposts that say, yeah, this is about where it should be. Now, you can argue how that's done and who should be doing it, and that's a whole other discussion, but there's a thirst for that right now.
Would you agree that the ICERs of the world are similar philosophically to the transparency issue, which is they are not really an optimal solution, but they are something that people are holding on to because we're not providing them with a credible substitute?
Yeah, I think they're part of the solution, but it's better than nothing, and it does certainly help payers and other stakeholders looking at a category. So we can't make decisions that look to maximizing the ecosystem, but for a category, it can help us make informed decisions that meet our member needs, which is what we care about.
So I'm just going to, I see we have a question from the audience, so I'm going to let her ask, and then hopefully, Rena, you can be the first to respond.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Leora Schiff from Altea Strategy Consulting. First of all, thank you. This is a wonderful panel. I think you're bringing a lot of very interesting points together and having a very collaborative discussion, which is really what we need. And I want to actually evolve the concept of collaboration across stakeholders in order to address some of the uncertainties related to evidence as it evolves through clinical development. There are opportunities for potential collaborations between manufacturers and payers who have tremendous data resources, where if that information were available, it might be possible or provide better information to guide clinical development. And potentially there are opportunities for continued collaboration for real-world evidence after the fact. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of these opportunities that aren't currently being leveraged right now that could potentially bend the cost curve.
So I mean, I think, again, it depends on whether cost or spending is related to price or it's related to quantity. My view, one of the really exciting things is trying to get a handle on how drugs are actually being used in the population, both on-label and off-label. Clearly, with the advent of alternative payment models, both in Medicare but also being pursued by the commercial insurers, we're going to have a lot more data about exactly how patients and physicians are using these drugs and other modalities as well, and what works and what doesn't in the real world.
Great. And I'm just going to ask for closing comments to either address the question and or anything else you want to talk about in closing. So.
Yeah, so first of all, just before closing comment, just to your point, our institute, which includes the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School, has a large agreement with the FDA to do what's called Sentinel, which is essentially the largest post-marketing surveillance study going on that looks across us and other payers, that pulls in that data to provide these kind of associations. And what I'm actually very excited about is I have a new agreement with this biosimilars consortium to try to look at the biosimilars and assess the value equation. So I think that's a great example of leveraging the data repository. In terms of closing comments, just it's my first time at this meeting. I'm not sure I'll be invited back, but I think I think just the fact that you've invited a payer to this meeting, that we're having this dialogue, and what I hope that you're seeing is not a lot of contentiousness, but a general desire, and I think we're all representative to some extent of our industries, but a general desire to figure out how do we work together. If we can't, we're all going to see greater regulation, and I don't think any of us want that. And the other thing I'll close with is, again, our mission is to serve our stakeholders and to make sure that people get the medications and the care that they need. And I think by focusing on that mission and not on reducing drug costs, which is not our goal, I think we're going to get to a better place.
Yeah, three things. First, real-world evidence and using data resident in health plans is already massively part of what we're doing. I'm sure we could do more, but I don't want to leave the question there. It is a big piece of it. Secondly, I think we've touched on it a few times here, but one of the things about outcomes-based agreements that elucidates, and I find a lot of times payers and our customers who are paying for drugs think it's all, we're very focused on pricing as an industry. We need to do a better job of explaining what we are focused on, which is first our missions, which are the same. Make life better is the mission of my company. And secondly, a return to shareholders, which isn't the same as high pricing. A return is a function of price times quantity minus the expenditures to get it to market. So we're interested in optimizing any of that combination to give a return to our shareholders. Faster uptake, access to more patients, those are all attractive features. And finally, I agree completely with Michael. When we sat down with Anthem a year ago, we were surprised at how much common ground we had. And by focusing on that and just advancing the ball, I think we can do a lot to stave off what could be some pretty dangerous rhetoric turning into dangerous legislation out of our nation's capital. I think we need some urgency to demonstrate that we can find success together.
Great, thank you.
I forget if it was Benjamin Franklin who said, if we don't hang together, we will surely all hang separately. And I think that's really where we are, and you're hearing that theme played out. What I'm encouraged by is panels like this, and a number of groups are now sponsoring this. At the Bio board meeting a few months ago, we actually had 4 people present to the entire board from managed care. And it was an eye-opener, right? Because we're locked in our own little universe, and we're looking out, sort of out of Plato's cave and reading the shadows on the wall. And interpreting that is hard, and trust begins with an understanding of what the concerns of the other side are. And to do that, I think we need to have more and more of these types of conversations. They don't necessarily have to be on a stage in front of an audience, but we need to have more and more of these. I see Wayne Koberstein here from Life Science Leader. Life Science Leader has taken a leading role in pulling cross-sectional groups together to participate in panels like this. So I think it starts with that, and then out of that, you begin to develop ideas that can be implemented first in experiments, and then if they work, to publicize those and have them taken up.
Great. Ron, Dave, Michael, Rena, thank you so much, and thank you for your attention this afternoon.